Mr. Tomlin, good morning to you yet again.
Good morning to you again. Nice to speak.
As always.
A pleasure is mine. And as we explore the richness of music of Black origin,
absolutely,
and its impact on the various different decades and the creative power brokers that defined that particular period in each given decade. So
talking about periods and decades, then we're now going to go from the 80s to the 90s, and we're going to explore with your wonderful knowledge or down the highways and avenues and cul-de-sacs. Well, over to you, sir.
Cul-de-sac, that sounds very interesting. Well, when we go into the 80s, of course, the 80s is interesting for me because in the 80s, I lived in two different countries, a period from the early 80s to the mid 80s. I was in the UK under the Thatcher government.
Remember it well.
Yes, and of course the racial violence that actually transpired both in Alston and in Tottenham. And it's quite interesting to actually look at what has actually transpired. Have we learned from that as things improved in the respective community for people of color or ethnic minority? What has it done as the government and the respective government agencies, both in Europe and the UK, have they give lip service but not really defined or developed the infrastructure, the issues that was raised? Because when you have a racial riot or any riot, there's always underlying issues why it actually transpires. Some people have their personal agendas within it, and some people have genuine issues that impact the community in general, where they're fighting for the community at large. But unfortunately, with all these different things, you have people, individualists, who are concerned about their bread and butter or creating something for themselves that's interested in themselves alone. Anyhow, quite the interesting thing about the 80s in particular, a new bunch of creative power brokers came to an existence. And you've heard me mention before LA and Babyface, and also Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. These are the new, what you call new emerging creative entities that define the sound from the 80s onwards, the middle 80s. And of course, with the Gamble Enough, they will begin to surrender the baton. First, they were getting older, they were getting tired. They worked 24 hours to create the Philly sound. And now, it's time to give it to a younger generation.
Yes, the pattern of life, we call it.
Pattern of life. Because and also during the 80s as well, we lost our dear friend, the late Bob Marley, and he's significant to the music industry. And we look at the legacy of his legendary compilation album, which includes Buffalo Soldier, which was a phenomenal recording project, because as we move fast forward to 2021, it sold over 50 million copies in the US. Wow. And we fast forward from the time it was released in 1984, fast forward.
Excellent.
Yes, 15 million copies.
Phenomenal.
Yeah. And it's been, and the interesting thing about Bob Marley, before we go on further with the other creative power brokers and artists, is that he's the only artist whose average, as a dead artist, average about 10 million in gross earning for his estate per year in the US.
Really?
Yeah, over the last 10, 15 years, average gross earning for the family estate. For the estate, $10 million to do with merchandise and movement, digital movements and so on of his recordings.
That's a lot of money. And may I say that, his music is so impactful, or has been, and still is, but also the political aspect of his life has also been very, very, and I believe him still today, very, very influential in the political world. Because,
Yes, of course. I would say that he has a political philosophy which tends to challenge or define the new political school of the day. Like, for instance, the Ukraine presidents seem to have that kind of fighting spirit that belongs to the Nelson Mandela and Bob Marley. You notice he's prostrate. He's willing to fight to his death.
Absolutely.
And that is a very rare sort of political leader.
Yes, you got these people who are definitely have the courage of their convictions. So therefore, they're going to fight to the end, the bitter end.
Yeah, and how do you actually, even if you destroy him, even if Putin destroy him as a person, he's going to go down as a significant hero and a political giant compared to Putin. Putin would be going down in history as a failure.
Absolutely.
And this guy's going to go,
as we talk about Bob Marley, it's exactly that, isn't it? It's got a political giant as well as a musical giant.
Yes, exactly. So, but yeah. So the 1980s, quite phenomenal period. Around sort of 1986, 1987. 87 is when I celebrate my 30th birthday. Yeah. And what is significant about that period is that Michael Jackson did the Bad Project, Bad. And on top of that, Philly International Record and the Gamble Enough did their last R&B #1 with Loving You with the OJs before they departed and went to EMI. So it's significant. So it showed that they still showed the power of the Philly sound in actually dethroning a major hit-making track by Michael Jackson and take it off the #1 spot. Done by a legendary vocal group by the OJs with a legendary production team that they were signed to, Gamble Enough, knock it off the #1 position. And Loving You is a very sweet string supported, a powerful bass drum line by the Quinton Joseph, originally from Chicago, part of the Chicago soul sound. So I'll give you a bit of history there.
Right.
And then the year 1986, when I got married, the Jones Girls surviving member, Shirley Jones, did a #1 track, which lasts for 2 weeks. Do you get enough love? Which was a monster, almost sold 1 million copies. Right. So there's a lot of significant things from that black label before the Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis takes center stage with Janet Jackson, because in '86 Janet Jackson came out with Control. Do you have enough lately, or whatever it was track was, Nasty Boys and so forth.
That was a blast. That was a blast.
There was a blast. That was a tremendously successful album because it was an album that did 6 million copies for Janet Jackson. That was a second solo album in A&M Records.
Right.
And it did 6 million copies with several #1s. Prior to that as well, I think around 1984, we had the late Whitney Houston with her first solo album, which did 14 million copies, Saving All My Love for You and so forth.
My
14 million copies, instant, first solo album.
I can tell you, right, that Whitney Houston, right, amongst others, is one of the most played records for servicemen and women away from home. Yes. When you're away in wherever, away from your family. Those are the messages that family send back.
Saving all my love for you.
Yes.
That is a powerful, because
Absolutely.
what it does, it prepares you for that meeting. See?
Yes.
Yes, and then prior to Whitney Houston coming on to the scene, you had Madonna with Borderline, an album that she put that was co-produced by the late Reggie Lucas. Reggie Lucas was part of the James and Toomey and Reggie Lucas production that was responsible for Stepney Mill hits,
Wow.
Hits during the late 70s into the early 80s with Two Hearts Are Always Better with Teddy Prendergast, what she did with the duet with Teddy Prendergast, Two Hearts Always Better,
Do you want to give us any more musical of your voice this? Do you want to give us any
more? Well, remember, I used to sing in the adult choir when I was in the 60s, you see. So
all right, okay. Well, it's still there.
Yes, I am still, I am accustomed to singing in groups and so forth.
Okay.
My tenor, alto, but anyhow. Yeah.
Anyhow.
So we talk about all those hits making sessions that came through. Never, like for instance, Never Knew Love Like This Before with Stephanie Mills, which we had received a Grammy Award for R&B song of the year for the co-producers and co-writers and co-composers, James and Toomey and Reggie Lucas. Both of these men are now dead, unfortunately. One died early this year, James and Toomey, at around about 75. It's a sad story, but he's the one who did Juicy Fruit track. Okay. Which was, that itself was a phenomenal, because that was used on 2 occasions by Faith Evans and Mr. Biggs on their respective recordings during the 90s going into 2000. Yes, and the Bad Boy production, according to P. Diddy.
Wow. Yes. I must say, the way these names roll off your tongue, hey, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Well, okay. So I'm just whetting people's appetites as we enter into the 80s.
Yes.
The 80s is very fascinating because several female artists of prominence and impact emerge. Like, for instance, Janet Jackson, the Karen White, and Jodie Watley, who used to be Jodie Watley used to be the lead singer for the Shalamars, Shalamars during the early 80s. Second time around, that Monster hit track on the Black label. Second time around, right around the same time. That was the Black label that was based on the West Coast in Los Angeles, called The Sound of Los Angeles Solo Records, founded by the legendary, the late Dick Griffin, who passed away, but he was a great record black executive who created a body of work. Matter of fact, in the early 80s, when the label exploded, it grossed about $40 million in gross earning.
40 million.
1980, $40 million. Now let's equate that in 40 million, equate that into present day currency or inflation. That's probably about 200 to 300 million or maybe more.
Wow. Amazing.
Right. Don't forget now, as I mentioned before, that the music of Black origin up to the late 70s to the early 80s had grossed about $600 million. $600 million in the US alone. In the US alone, we're not talking about globally, in the US alone.
Okay.
With such hit tracks as Stop Till You Get Enough by Michael Jackson, which and also Boogie Wonderland was coming right around that time. A string arranged by the black string arranger called Benjamin Wright Jr. Benjamin Wright Jr. did those tracks during 70 early 80s, monster arrangements. And both of those tracks are million sellers. It's roll off. So, and then don't forget you had Peaches and Herb with United.
Wow.
Oh, that was a million seller.
Wow.
Yeah.
I must admit, you know, you're just going through the ages and the years and the decades there, and there's so many names that
Oh yes, there's somebody
walking up.
because yes, because you have the Ashford and Simpson, you have the Ashford and Simpson production, what they did with Diana Ross with you know, It's My House and The Boss and so forth. These are all monster hit albums. And then when you go into the early 80s, you have Janet Jackson, Diana Ross returning again with Diane, coming out with Ashford with Chic Productions. Remember, with Chic Productions, you had Chic and We Are Family with the Sledge Sisters, Sister Sledge, right? All these albums, including Bee Gees and all the soundtrack album as well. All these were responsible for the gross earning that transpired during the late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
And don't let us not forget I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor. I Will Survive.
My goodness.
So all that was just, and you had Peter Bryson with I'm So Into You. That ballad, that smoking ballad, and then Teddy Pendergast with Turn Off the Light.
Oh my goodness.
All that is happening at the same time. Boom.
I remember that so well, you know.
Yes, that is from the multi. Yes, from the multi. Yes, boy, from the multi-platinum album. I mean, the industry was roasting then. But the funny thing, the industry was going through its financial struggle, but yet it's always a bunch of black guys that really shifted, because Quincy Jones actually saved the industry with the Off the Wall album, which sold 8 million copies in its first run. 8 million copies, bro, in its first run.
Amazing.
So I'm just giving you a summary before we hit the haters at full throttle.
Yeah. So the 80s then pretty much almost seemingly just so the 70s go into the 80s and then straight into the 90s.
Yes, because that's right. Because during the 80s we had Prince emerge with with Purple Rain album, which sold almost 19 million copies in the US alone. Then you had Lionel Richie second solo album, which did 10 million copies.
Oh my God.
All Night Long was part of, everything was going on at the same time. Then you had Luther Vandross with Never Too Much, and all the other tracks. And then you have Sade with, Sade's activities, Love Is Key and all that, everything going on at the same time. So you have all these giants. I mean, by the mid 80s, these giants were doing, these black recording entities were doing about 30% of the gross earning of the music industry in the US,
So, may I ask you this question already?
Yes.
Do you see the black people themselves got a majority share of the monetary value of the industry?
Well, it's a very yes and no question. Depends on who is controlling the should I say the copyrights. Intellectual property is a very important part of the equation, because it's really the bread and butter in the long term for the industry. And it's a bread and butter for long term for the respective creative entities who can compose the track, produce it, arrange it, etc. Now, it depends on the sort of deals that they actually arrange and what are the percentages. Yes.
Right. So you start with the actual lyrics, if you like.
Yes.
Who owns the lyrics, and then that's the starting point, the musical input and everything else. So
Yes,
it's all
yeah.
sectored into percentages as to who does what.
Yeah, as Kenneth Gamble would say, there's only so much you can do with a US dollar. It's the same thing. There's only so much you can do with a UK pound, isn't it? If you break it down, like I get 5% of that to the UK pound, another person, the songwriter gets probably what, 30%, you know, and it breaks it down in those respective orders, the arranger, the studio man, and so forth and so on.
Right.
So these are key factors. How you, my issue has always been, really, I don't care what a Black producer here or in the US is talking about. I'm always asking the question, what is your percentage of your return on the long term?
Yes, so the royalties is what we're talking about here.
Yes, we're talking about the royalties here.
Yeah.
What is it? What is it at the end of the day? What is it?
Yeah, and it, you know, does the royalty stay rigid in terms of the original agreement, percentage-wise, according to who does what? Does the royalty sort of pan out over the years and stay the same?
Yes, the royalties should stay the same if everything is being ironed out prior to production.
Okay.
You don't want to do it after the fact.
No.
It's like the cow has gone through the gate. You know,
yes.
what we do.
Yes.
We need to sort this out prior to he or she going out into the prairie.
Yeah.
Because when they go out there, a song that, look, for instance, it is well known that a song that a collective group of songwriters wrote might be sitting in the can, right? All of a sudden, a new kid on the block visit the archives and decide to record that. And you know what? It becomes a monster hit globally. Woohoo!
Well, yes, because I believe currently we have cases going on where other artists are being sued for supposedly copying other people's work.
Plagiarizing, yes.
Absolutely.
We have Sam Smith with the respective Black lady. We have another female, I think from the UK too, if I can't remember, who is being sued for songs that were recorded previously, and they look very similar. You know, one of the big problem with the new generation, I find out, is that they need to become very discerning with their recording and thinking that it's original. No, it isn't. You have to make sure that to have something original, you have to start it from scratch and structure it. Yes. And they could learn that from many of the great songwriting masters, such as the Gamble Enough, the Norman Whitfield, etc., and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. If you notice with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, they don't have lawsuits. Why? Because everything they do is original.
Okay.
They don't rush this thing. They spend time to create something new and fresh. So they won't get sued. So every time I talk about music history in particular, I'm not talking because I'm copying somebody. I am original in my statement and my analysis.
Right.
So nobody can say that I sound like John down the road. No, I'm not. There's no way I sound like anybody else because I'm original. Kevin Tomlin, music historian, original from the word go, from the beginning.
Ladies and gentlemen, you may be hearing this for the first time, right here and now, if you haven't heard it before.
Yes, precisely. Because I don't repeat myself. No. Because that is one thing I ask the Lord, help me to order my stuff and not let me repeat myself. You might hear something similar, but it's always a new story when you hear me come back again and present it. Yes, because I'm talking about the impact. As I mentioned about the 1980s, I did a lot of creative things. I was painting, I was doing youth work, and I was teaching, amongst other things.
So you talk about paintings, those things on the wall there.
Yes.
Paintings?
there are indeed these ones an interpretation. Most of them are interpretations to do with Stevie Wonder's Key in the Song of Life. This one, Key in the Song of Life. Many of them talking about his creative music journey right up to his last album during the 1970s.
Wow.
And then some of them is over there interpreting different things in his creative, that particular book, that inner vision and so forth.
So all those paintings behind you there are your handiwork?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Wow. Such talent, sir.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. Well done.
Yes, because I go from visual to sonic, because I used to teach drama as well, you see, before I retired. So, and I used to teach literature. So I went the full creative flair, the whole experience.
Man of many talents, eh?
Yes. Yeah.
Superb.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So as we're talking about the 1980s, we have during the 1980s, the next production team to emerge of significance was L.A. Reid and Babyface, who came out the musical workshop of Solar Records. Their first million seller they produced and first R&B #1 was for the Whispers, called Rock Steady.
Oh, the Whispers.
Yes. Oh, Whispers. The Whispers. You remember the Whispers with and the beats goes on.
Yes,
my and the beat goes on. Yeah. True. Powerhouse there.
Wow.
Yes. And so these brothers, and the interesting thing about L.A. Reid and Babyface, Dick Griffin, who was the owner of Solar Records, allowed him to get personal training from his senior sound engineer to teach them the whole mechanics of studio production, to get them to develop their craft. They were mentored by this brother.
Wow.
For a period of time. So they went down in the studio and they learned him how to master sound sonically, understanding how to give their work body and depth and impact.
Very important.
Yes, very important. So Dick Griffin was responsible for the success of L.A. Reid and Babyface, these two productions. And the interesting thing, as we go on into the 90s and so on, L.A. Reid became a very powerful power broker in terms as a recording executive. And he was responsible for Usher's Explosion, Tony Braxton, Pink, and so forth.
Wow. And in all this time, is there an injection from the UK market?
Well, of course, there was always injection. It was not always obvious. Yes, let us go back to the UK market now. Let's look at our friend Fix McIntyre. Yes, from the New Testament Church of God.
Wow.
His father was the legendary Jeremiah McIntyre, one of our legendary bishops and founding fathers of the church in Black movement, the church movement in the UK. Oh yes, his father was Fix McIntyre's father was a multi-instrumentalist. He was also a songwriter, and he was a brilliant choir master and conductor and everything.
Wow.
And with Fix McIntyre and his sister Pamela McIntyre, they actually founded, was part of the Majestic Choir.
Okay.
No, it wasn't the Majestic Choir. I need to correct that. It was the Highgate Choir. Highgate Choir.
Highgate. That's a Highgate, as in Birmingham here. Highgate.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's right. Came out from that church in particular, and they did 1 or 2 albums. And Fricks, you could hear Frick's technical production with that and his arrangement. It was more funky than the majestic one, which had a much more, maybe a polished sound, more sort of a contemporary sound, according to Steve Thompson. Two technically brilliant men. One came from out of Answorth.
Place of my youth.
Yes, and also with Steve Thompson, he was trained by, he learned his instrumentation from the legendary Deacon King, Reuben King's father, who is in his 90s, a legend, who taught many of the youngsters guitar lessons and was instrumental in keeping the music going in several churches in the Birmingham and North the Midlands area. This legendary brother.
Fantastic.
Who's still around today, but he's living abroad. But
Yes.
he's behind the scene. He's the mastermind in actually able to develop the skill set of some of the musicians we know today.
And do I believe that there's a link with Simply Red?
Well, there's probably might be a link with Simply Red on that as well, because Deacon King was very instrumental in the early days. Matter of fact, his house was the training ground where a lot of youngsters came to get their, should I say, musical lessons, and he used to play football outside and all sorts of things. Right. So it was a communal setting. I don't know how Sister King managed with all these young hothead boys and girls in her house, but that must be quite, it just remind me when I was growing up with all the young people coming in at my father's house all the time. It's quite an open door situation, and Brother Bishop Deacon King was responsible for a lot of these youngsters' musical skill and brilliance, and Stephen Thompson mentioned about how important he was in his life as he developed as a musician and as a composer, etc., and an arranger and a producer. Yes, so when we go back to that, let's go back to Frix McIntyre.
Yes.
What is significant about Frix McIntyre? Aha. Well, he was a key founding member responsible for a group that became the 13th best-selling UK act of all time, Simply Red.
Right. That's what I was alluding to.
Yes, the 13th best-selling British group, between the 13th to the 15th best-selling British group of all time. The last figure I read, according to Billboard magazine, by 1996, Simply Red had generated 25 million copies globally. Wow. 25 million copies globally in record movement units, 25 million units. I assume that's mostly, we're looking at the album data. We don't look at the singles so much, but albums. Yeah. Now, how do we quantify that in today's money? 25 million copies. Let's say, if we say that each particular copy sells about £10, so 25 of that would be 250 million. Right? Absolutely. Then you quantify it into that, in today's money, we could be running into billions.
Amazing.
And with Frix McIntyre, he was at the top of the game with Simply Red. He co-wrote some of the stuff, he arranged the vocal, and he sung as well, sung, duet and so on. And he was responsible for all 5 of the albums. He was behind the scene. And if you listen to If You Don't Know Me By Now, you hear his keyboard riff and arrangement. Yes, that's him.
Big hit, that one.
That was a monster hit. That went #1 in the US. And as a matter of fact, it was written by Gambler Nuff, the original, who did it with Aaron Melvin and the Blue Notes featuring Teddy Pendergast originally, which went to #3 on the Hot 100. But this time around, when Simply Red did it, it went to #1 in the Hot 100. Yes. So it became a monster hit. Monster. 1 million copies it sold, and it gave Gamble Enough a Grammy Award for Songwriter of the Year. Yes.
Wow. Wow.
So that is highly significant during
Absolutely.
the
Absolutely.
yes, highly significant. And what is also interesting as well is that with Simply Red, on average, they did about sometime between 2 to 3 million copies per time in Europe alone. In terms of units, shipped in Europe. So in actual fact, they were performing in some of the largest arenas in the world globally. So they were actually, in terms of creative export, they were one of Britain's most important creative export earners.
I think that had a large influence from people of the church, who contributed so much towards that. And the public don't necessarily see that, do they?
No, because many of the facts are behind the scene. Actually, it takes me and you to actually bring these bring this to present in the sonic atmosphere, and people to become aware that these things do exist. These are we're trying to actually correct history, which is not spoken about, because when they talk about Simply Red, the only person I see is Nick at the front.
Yes.
Nobody talks about the other creative engine. I mean, like Frix McIntyre, who died last year, quietly, and have a little notation within the only publication that really spoke something significant about him was the Italian press, really. Other than that, it was
really,
wasn't really. I mean, but if you think about it, after Frix left Simply Red, they were not able to match the sales level that they were accustomed to when he was with the group over the 5 studio albums.
Yet, the story isn't there, is it? You won't see it unless, like you say now, we are bringing this out into the open.
Yes, that's why the forgotten generation, it touch a nerves in my body, you see. The forgotten generation toughs and nerves in my subconsciousness, my whole psyche. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because the thing about it is that I'm interested in actually bringing to the table our creative power brokers who are men and women of Black origin.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't apologize that. I've had enough of that nonsense. I say it as it. I hit with my look. I hit it exactly as it's supposed to be said.
Absolutely, and totally agree 100%.
100%. So I'm not going to debate about it and say, should I say it? I've actually said that. So if you want to challenge me on that, fine. Who cares?
I endorse that 100%.
Yes. So this is what I'm about. So when we're talking about music of Black origin, we're talking about it, how it actually impacts culturally, internationally, across the board, across multi-language, across multi-ethnic backgrounds and style and politics, etc. It speaks volume. Absolutely. I remember when I went to Spain on holiday in one of the Spanish islands, went into the mall and it says playing Buffalo Soldier. I mean, come on, it was a Buffalo. Okay, right. Cultural.
Yes.
End of story.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Man has been dead from the 1980s, and he's still rocking and touching the conscience of each new kid on the block. Went into schools and students would ask me, "So you know Bob Marley?" I said, "What?" I said, "What? Please say that again. What did you say? Do I know Bob Marley?" Look, bruv, I was living in Jamaica when he started to emerge. We went to school near to his home, where in Tilbury Garden. Come on, what are you talking about, boy?
Yes, phenomenal.
Yes. So I remember an interesting story. I was teaching a youngster at primary school, And I said, what music do you listen to? He said, sir, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't. I said, come on, surprise me. He said, both myself and my family listen to Sam Cooke. I said, oh, I said, whoa. Remember, he's still in primary school in year 10.
Sam Cooke?
I said, come on again, boy. Say it again. What did you say? Year 9. I didn't reach year 6 yet. I listen to Sam Cooke, sir. That's what my family is. I said, okay. White boy.
Yeah.
Should I say anything more? Not really. Look, I mean, by the as I said, by the mid 80s, Black creative entities and recording artists was doing 30% of the US market share. 30%.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about running in the billions. And another interesting thing about that period, there would begin to be there was a Black label by the name of Taboo. Taboo is where Alexander O'Neill came out of, and SOS Band and so forth. So this was another group of new kids on the block who were actually creating hits. And of course, Jimmy Jam was involved in those various different productions, you know. So it wasn't unusual for a Black artist during the 80s to do 1 million copies in the UK alone with a single, you know, and albums.
Absolutely. And you know what was very effective as well was, and you know me, I'm always talking about military life, as my past is exposed to that. These artists come and they go to around the world, and they're so welcomed by people serving abroad or even serving at home. But that musical message to a service person was fantastic, even for that moment, that day, that week when they come and perform, you know. So well received in almost every case.
Yeah, and then you as men who been in different theatre in the world. Notice the word, I use the word theatre. It's a military term. Theatre.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you're meeting a lovely white lady, a Black lady, entertaining you. You forget about who she is because you're so glad to hear, you're glad to see a lovely female, or glad to hear somebody talking about a message that synchronized with your wife back home and family.
Absolutely.
It's, you know, for people to say, I remember my friend, Joan Cartwright said, what would it be like, Kevin, without music? I said, brother, sister, I don't know. I think we'd be in serious trouble as a people, and as a
your whole existence would be completely different.
So, and the funny thing about that, with music in particular, during the conservative years, especially in the US under the Reagan administration and also under Thatcher administration, some of the most dynamic Black entities came out, like the Princes and so on. You know, I mean, by the time the 90s or the 80s was completed, you had the sound according to Minneapolis, you know, with what Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis did, what they did with the Johnny Gill and the New Edition, etc. All the sound that was coming out from the city, and how it changed. You can imagine these two men becoming one of the most successful Black producers of all time. They're still produced today, would you believe it? After starting in the 1980s, yeah.
Did they start out together or did they start out separately and then?
No, they started out together. They became a production team together, yes.
Right.
And they never split. They never do things on their own. They always produce and write together. They are the longest running production team, songwriting team, and the songwriting team with the most number ones globally as a Black.
Wow.
Very interesting, isn't it?
Yes, very, very interesting. And they've always been based in the USA?
Yes. They're not in Minneapolis at the moment because it's cold and they're on the West Coast, but they still have the same sound and they pay homage. As a matter of fact, the sound engineer that worked with them consistently for 17 years was a gentleman who worked at Solar Records on the West Coast before he was recruited by them with Flytime studio and production, yes. Steve Hodges became their main sound engineer, responsible for so many hits. But the hits that these three men did, or sound engineer and so on, the hit records will go around this room about several times. This certification.
I guess people like them will probably have their own museum, right?
Well, I mean, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis can have a museum if they want to, with all the costumes, their production, their instruments and everything. Yes, they can, yeah.
Fantastic.
And they had their own label called Perspective Records, which was responsible for Barry White return to #1 with the icon is love, practice what you preach, you know, and all that stuff. And yeah,
that's another name you just roll.
That's another brother. That is another
Whoa.
production entity from the 80s. I mean, with Barry White, but at the top of his game, Barry White did about $36 million for the industry. $36 million for the first run. First run. Look.
You know, every so often it's like it's life, isn't it? You know, yes. There's an emerging artist, you know, just spring up from somewhere, just like nature planned it. You know, the seed is planted somewhere, and then it just grows.
Now, this is interesting about Barry White. After he died, is one of his greatest hit album. Did about 5 million copies in Europe alone. 5 million after his death.
Wow. That's another name, isn't it?
Well, this is my brother called him creative juggernaut. Barry White is just what? I can't get enough of your love, baby. First, my last, my everything. Look, did you see? It's a touch of nerves.
Yes. Wow.
Oh, phenomenal.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, Barry White used to mentor Michael Jackson. You know, Michael Jackson.
Is that right?
Yes, Michael Jackson used to ask him questions about what it is to be a star. Because remember, by the time Michael Jackson became a solo artist, he hung around Teddy Pendergrass and all of them. He learned from these guys because they were the kingpins of the day. Because remember, Teddy was the sex image of the late 70s. I mean, well, anyhow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another story, right?
It's another story. That's another. Whoa. Oh dear. That makes you sweat, you know. Look, if you notice, we're just dabbling around the 80s and we haven't pulled out yet because there's so many things coming out. You know, you had the Jodie Watley and oh my goodness, and all the other Karen Whitewood, you know, woman, you know, they're talking about woman empowerment, you know.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes. Because this, although it might not be balanced, the women are very much there, aren't they? In
oh yes, the woman became the woman. The 80s really saw women becoming powerful hit making, like the Madonnas of the world. I mean,
mm,
they start to do the figures that was synonymous and custom to male artists.
mm,
They were actually pulling in the gross earnings for live concerts. They were talking about hundreds of millions. If you put all the collective, the Whitney Houston, all them together, they were generating hundreds of millions in terms of concert revenue. And don't forget advertisement, endorsement, movie soundtracks. We haven't even started looking at Mariah Carey yet, an 80s phenomenon, right? She was an 80s, no, she was a 90s phenomenon. Sorry, she came so when we go into the 90s now, when we go and revisit the 90s,
mhm,
the next, what we're looking at, future episode, because what has actually occurred is that everything is fluid. You see, we go
mhm,
back and forth, because later on we're going to take a look at what happens for the mid 90s again with the Kurt Franklins and so on of the world, and especially when we look at gospel. Let us not forget, I remember quite significantly when I used to do a concert to see Jesse Dixon, who one of Jesse Dixon's second solo album for Word was produced, a lot of it was produced in Chicago, using some of the major Chicago session musicians, and that was a big selling album that sold about probably 400,000 copies, quite a large sum. And the interesting about it is that gospel music was beginning to move large units, but not yet. A few
yeah,
people, like
yeah,
Dollar Homes and so on, they would do gold here and there. But it was the late 80s with when CCM, BB Wineland begin to. They were the first. They were the first black duos to actually do platinum
right,
million
right.
copies. Yeah.
You you mentioned various states. You just
Mm-hmm,
mentioned Chicago
mm-hmm.
in the USA, and obviously when you talk about UK, you mention obviously London and Birmingham or whatever. Um, is there like a particular state that's more um, significant than in any other in terms of producing artists?
Well, there are several states. We could actually, let's break it down. You have the East Coast, according to New York, where you had Madonna came out of, right? Madonna, Ashford and Simpson, okay, and people like Stephanie Mills, that their recordings was produced in that particular city,
Mm,
and Chic production, Chic,
yeah,
and
big.
Sister Sledge,
Oh gosh, man.
for fun, they
Yeah.
talk about, you got your monster hit
Mm,
that came out from that city, and then in that same city, you had David Bowie, 1980, Let's Dance album came out of there, China Girl, boom,
mm.
by the Chic production, by Chic, you know. Madonna, and then Madonna, like a Virgin album by the same
Wow.
Nile Rodgers, the Nile Rodgers production. Right. So that is the East Coast in New York. Then you
Right.
got Philly on the East Coast, Philly sound, according to the OJs, the 3 Degrees, Aaron Melvin and the Blue Notes,
Wow.
Teddy Prendergast, the
Ah!
Jones Girls. I mean, and then you got McFadden and Whitehead. Me and Mrs. Jones by Billy Paul. Lou Rawls, You Never Find, coming out of Philly, bum, 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 right there. And then you go down to Miami, the sound according to TK and the Soundshine Band. That's the way, I like. Yeah, see that, just come right there. And then Clean Up Woman by Betty Wright.
Oh my goodness.
That is Miami sound there. Boom.
Mm.
And then we go West Coast according to Barry White. Los Angeles, Barry White. Soda Records according to Shalimar and Whispers. Bill Withers, Ain't No Sunshine When It Rains. Boom, 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 boom. Lean on Me. Bum, 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 bum.
Amazing.
Okay. Yeah. West Coast. The Rose Royce. Love Don't Love Me Anymore. Love Don't Live Here Anymore. Yeah. Car Wash. West Coast. You know, Keep On Trucking according to Eddie Kendrick. Keep on trucking. You see what I mean? Just split it up right there.
So if you were to split the UK market then in terms of that,
we can split it. We can split it. Manchester sound. You know, when you look at Birmingham, we're looking at the musical workshop according to Majestic Singers, Highgate Singers, and the Impact. You know, and then you've got the sound according to Kingship Records. Reverend Reuben King, his studio and production, that label, which is synonymous at Birmingham. Then you have in Birmingham, you have the legendary Black Studio at Grosvenor Road.
Yes.
Right in your doorstep, bro.
Yeah, absolutely.
Boom, boom, boom. So these sounds, these are behind the scene power brokers, you know. And then you have Sheffield, where James Poyser came out of as he impact Lauryn Hill, Adele, Jill Scott, you know, this brother, this smash, and Nora Jones, and so forth. This one brother, you know, going through all these different artists and production. Mary J. Blige, boom, 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 boom. So yes, they're different cities. And then when you go to Chicago now, you talk about Curtis Mayfield with Superfly. Freddie's Dead. You know, and then you talk about the Temptations. The Impressions rather, where it says
Marvin Gaye and all of that.
Marvin Gaye is from Detroit with Motown. You know, I heard it through the grapevine. You know,
oh gosh.
Oh yes, what's going on?
Yeah.
And let's get it on and so forth. Oh Lord, you see, you start to going crazy right there. And you notice I jumped back to the 70s, then we go to the 80s now.
Oh my God, what a musical journey.
Purple Rain.
Oh my God, absolutely fantastic, you know.
Yeah, so you see how the connections.
Yeah.
Love Don't Live Here Anymore by the Rose Royce. You know, Wish Upon a Star, Wish Upon a Star.
And you know, it's typical of music to sort of put you back in time at a certain place, you know, doing certain things.
Yes.
You know.
Yes. Certain things.
Yes.
The first time you met your wife. Oh, yeah. Well, that's another discussion, isn't it?
Another time, another place.
Another time in another place. Oh my goodness. Whoa. So this is, as one says, it's the soundtrack of your life. You know, different things going on.
Yes.
You know, different things and different impacts and so forth. And
you know what's coming to my head?
Yes.
You know, because it's typical of sometimes where I think is like if you were to map the musical influences, very much like you described them now as to where they're from. That's an interesting thing straight away, because a lot of people don't know the information you just imparted there about where these musical geniuses sort of were grown, you know, and until you mention certain band or
well,
groups.
Okay, let's just put this in perspective. the on riffs that you hear in Phil Collins, many of Phil Collins albums, it was done by a bunch of guys who were part of the Phoenix Horn section, which is to do with Earth, Wind and Fire, but they're originally from Chicago. They were Chicago session men under the direction and the creative input of Tom Washington, who is from the projects in Chicago, who worked on arrangements for Shy Lights.
Oh my God, listen to that. I'll be trouble if you left me now.
Listen, bro. Look. This brother, Tom Washington, was responsible for many of the hits to do with Earth, Wind and Fire, the arrangement, productions. He was a student of James Max, the legendary James Max, who was you could say one of the key architects of the Chicago soul sound, as he did arrangement for Honey, You Are My Shining Star by the Manhattans. That is Chicago classics. In the Mood, which sold 700,000 copies during the 80s for the late Tyrone Davis, a monster track with arrangement. In the Mood, 700,000 copies. And that's from Chicago. All that's from Chicago, bro.
This has been fantastic. Absolutely superb, because we've gone into so many, like we say, down the highway.
We come back and move forward. And it's all connective. It's all power connective.
Yeah. Have we covered 80s to 90s? Because obviously we're going to come to an end sometime, unfortunately.
No, I would always, the thing about it, we would always do summaries about it later on. Yes. But as I said to you, with my knowledge expansion as such, we could spend time on the 80s alone for long periods. So I'm going to actually let's say the 90s is a very interesting one, because although we've done some other episodes along the way already, going back and forth, the 90s is not it's not fully clean yet, clinically speaking, before we go into the 21st century, because we have to talk about the chart dominance in 95 to do with black recording acts, which they controlled most of the 95 they controlled part of that year at number one, where one black artist was taking the top position and moving millions of units as they dominate the top. It was so powerful that there were a lot of firsts. Michael Jackson debuted at number one of the first artists to do that with a million seller, and then
debuted at number one.
Yeah, at number one on the Hot 100. It just smashed. So yes, in our next sort of proceedings, we talk about that.
All right then. That's fabulous. So we know
we stop at that.
Yes. So we've been on that journey. We know where we've gone, although there's so much more that we could actually have inputted there. But we say now, this 3A, and the next time we go into 3B, and then we're going to go into the 90s the next time we speak. Is that right?
we revisit the 90s, the latter part of the 90s, before we actually go into the 21st century. And that's where it's going to be fascinating, because when we start to look at the numbers that are transpired in gospel, then it gets quite... what was going on with LaFace record and Bad Boy Production and Perspective Records. Wow.
Well, I think it's been fascinating already, so
it is.
Look forward to more.
Yes.
So, as always, Sir Tomlin, I thank you, sir. And let's catch up again in the very near future to do more of this.
Yes, it's a pleasure is mine, sir.
Absolutely, likewise mine as well. So thank you again.
You're welcome indeed. Rich blessings, rich blessings.
Likewise. Bye-bye.